as introduced, my name is Katie Graham, and I work at the Carleton Immersive Media Studio, which is a research lab associated with the School of Architecture in Ottawa, Canada. So we focus on 5 different streams of research that all have to do with how we can use new and emerging technologies to help in heritage architecture. The first being digitization, which is where we do point cloud and photogrammetry to record the heritage spaces. Building information modeling, where we convert that data into a model using Autodesk Revit. Simulations, when we use those models to help as an analysis tool. Digitally assisted fabrication, where we have 2 KUKA robots that are 6-axis robots that we use to assist in different milling for heritage purposes. And digitally assisted storytelling, where we take all of that information and figure out a way to share it with the public. And I am the team lead for the digitally assisted storytelling projects, where we use web, mobile, augmented reality, and virtual reality for this dissemination. And so today what I'm going to be talking about is how, for some of these digitally assisted storytelling projects that focus on virtual reality, how we've actually used some of the things that we've learned from building information modeling and the level of detail system there to help create more narratives that flow better, a level of detail for narrative spaces in virtual reality. Hold on.
We can also use the keyboard.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe it's a disconnection.
All right. So technical difficulties. So many of the projects that we have revolve around a significant project within Ottawa being the rehabilitation project of the Canadian Parliament buildings. So this is the centre block, which is the main building of our Canadian Parliament buildings. And it's about to undergo a 10-year rehabilitation project, which will actually close its doors, and all of the parliamentary activities that are within it will have to move elsewhere, and the public tours that are very common for school students as well as visitors to Ottawa will stop. So our work has a lot to do with that. So we've actually been working with the Canadian government since 2013 on this rehabilitation project, when we began to help them document the overall grounds, which you can see here. This is the Parliament Hill, and then we have the East Block, the West Block, and Centre Block. And so we helped to document them through photogrammetry and point cloud data with another government agency called Heritage Conservation Services. And then we've converted that data into a building information model using Autodesk Revit. And so here you can see just how detailed our point cloud data are of the space. We have both interior and exteriors of all of the buildings. And then we've converted them into extremely high detailed models within Autodesk Revit. This is a detail of that building information model of the Senate chamber wall. So when we were developing these building information models, we were looking at the different level of detail systems that currently exist for building information modeling. And I'm not really going to explain these because I think most of you, we already kind of talked about them a bit already today. But the thing that we noticed in all of these existing these protocols are that they all have to do with new construction. And they all have to do with the different phases of construction as you move from design to the actual building being built and facility management. And that level of development or level of detail for them kept progressing based off of that. But when we're looking at a heritage building, we're already at the built stage. So what level of detail do we put it in? And we needed to figure out a different way to control what level of detail we should show within our models. So we created our own system that also not only had that different purpose, but it also had a different approach, that it broke it into 3 different qualities, 3 different categories. So we had the level of detail, which was the graphical information, the representation. We had the level of information that was about that embedded information within it. And then the level of accuracy, which is about if we were recording the different deformations and deflections that occurred within the model that were recorded in point cloud. And these were 3 different categories that we could split apart and make it so then a different element within the space would have a different LOD, LOI, and LOA based off the information we had. And the one thing that really we can take from this when we move into how we've used it for virtual reality is the idea of level of detail being for the heritage significant spaces. So you can see here, this is the building information model of the rotunda, which is kind of that entrance space. And it was very, very labor intensive to get all of the different stone ribbing within the space as a building information model, but it was also very important to do for that heritage value of the space. So, as I said, I'm the team lead for the digitally assisted storytelling projects, and we've had a few different virtual reality projects that both have different passive or active qualities. And our first step into virtual reality was last year when we did a project called the VR Kiosk. That was, you can see there on the left, it was a walk-up VR station that you could experience one of 5 passive VR experiences that were about 2-minute long 360 videos that all focused around the Parliament buildings and the rehabilitation project. So these videos we compiled by creating using the building information model details, the panoramas, the point cloud data, as well as historical photos. And then we stitched them together using Adobe Premiere and Adobe After Effects. There was also sound effects, some animations within it, as well as a narrator explaining what's going on in the space. So when we switch, so this is kind of some of that feel within it, that this compiling of all the different details within it. And we were able to get some really good high quality images out of it. But when we switched to active VR and the use of game engines, we no longer had a rendered output. We needed to have everything be viewed in real time. So you can see, which had a lot of problems considering our data was so highly detailed. So we have on the left of the building information model of the Library of Parliament, one of the spaces within the Parliament buildings, and then on the right, we can see how we first started converting it into it. That when we first translated that data into it, it was too heavy to actually run, that we had to cut the space into a sliver. So only 1/8 of the space was shown, as you can see. And then this really made it so then we realized we had to figure out a way to decide what we were going to show and at what higher level of detail, which is when we started looking at existing level of detail systems within computer graphics. And so this, in the 70s, someone named James Clark introduced the idea of discrete LODs, which had to do with where you were, your proximity to the objects. And he pretty much stated that things that are farther away, you don't need to have as a high level of detail because, well, it's farther away, that your eyes just don't work like that. So you could have, so objects closer had to have a higher poly count, whereas objects farther away did not. As evident from this rabbit that he had 4 different variations of, one being 69,000 poly count and one being 76. But when they're staggered apart, they all look the same. So that idea of the point of view based level of detail, we actually did even incorporate when we did the VR kiosk, when things that were farther in the distance weren't as clear and crisp. And this actually helped us with our storytelling techniques, that when we had the crisp renderings close up, it really made it that be what you would look at. So we knew that this would help us in our creating of narration and a narrative flow within our VR experiences, even if we lost the control of like a passive VR experience that you could really lead someone through. And then just to bring it back to our level of detail system from the Sims Lodia, we also knew that really how we could do this is by taking the idea of the more significant spaces, the things we want to draw our attention to, those should be that higher level of detail, which you can see here with just how it was done within the model, that on the left, a space that's not heritage, like has no heritage or cultural significance of the attic, was a much lower level of detail than a space like the Senate foyer that we detailed quite to a high degree. Okay, so what system did we make then? And so we made a 3-tiered system that had LOD 1, 1.5, and 2. And we kind of started to outline how these would be built. And the LOD 1 elements were converted from the building information modeling pretty much directly. There's a lot more steps involved, but I'm just going to say they were converted and optimized, and just, but it's a lot more labor intensive than that. And then they could, our initial idea was that they wouldn't be textured, but later on then we had generic textures that weren't specific to the real world conditions. Then when we moved into LOD 1.5, this is when we actually needed to texturize them using the real world conditions. So it was the building information model converted into Unity, texturized with either photogrammetry data, point cloud data, or a photograph. And then the last one was LOD2, which was when we wouldn't use the Revit model anymore, the BIM model. We would actually create a photogrammetry model out of the information we have. And this was reserved for very important, significant items. So I'll go now into a bit more depth of each one. So for LOD1, I'm going to show the rotunda, which we saw earlier as the building information model. And you can see here, this is the left, that's the photo. It is a very intricate space. It has both a lot of details within the actual stone work, as well as there's lots of carvings within it. And when we brought it in, and this is a space we're currently developing, we brought it into Unity as the LOD1 item. All of that carving has been reduced or removed entirely, and there's no all the texturizing of this, the stonework is kind of, it's generalized. The thing in here that's contrasting is this column, which is actually an LOD2 item. But you can kind of see the difference in how your eye is still actually drawn to that column compared to the LOD1 items. For LOD 1.5, this was very good for when we had a lot of planar textures or things that were, the color was really important, but its actual geometry wasn't as much. So you can see here the stained glass windows is a perfect example of when we used LOD 1.5. That we had the planar surface of the window from the point cloud from the Revit model, and then we brought in the texture from, well, in this case it was high quality photos. And the same for the ceiling. This is the Senate foyer, and we have, the ceiling is very important, so we took the photogrammetric data that we had and got an image from it to texturize it, which you can see how it compares to the rest of the building that's at 1.5. So LOD2 items was reserved for the things that were most important in the spaces, and that's because they had a huge poly count associated with them, as well as they were very labor intensive. So we really just wanted to use them for key spot elements, such as statues. That's a Queen Victoria statue that's in the Library of Parliament, or stone reliefs on the top. That's the Canadian frieze within the House of Commons foyer. And then also for smaller items that you really need to draw someone's attention into, like these small little wood carvings in the wood of the library that were about this big that you really wanted to pull someone in. Okay. So that's how we categorized them. But to decide when we would use certain things, we looked at 3 different factors, being proximity, significance, and storytelling. And for proximity, I mean, this is always one that's a little bit tricky, considering in VR you should be able to move around. But the way that we were looking at VR is that you have a certain point of view that you can move around as far as your tether allows, since there's always a tether, but you couldn't actually teleport from the different spaces. So we would try to reserve all of those LOD2 items and LOD 1.5 items to the things that were closer to you. But it was also that we would even spend more time on the processing and the cleaning of the LOD1 items in that space. So things that were close to you were going to have heavier poly count, as well as those higher level of details, whereas things farther away could kind of disappear a bit. And then the second was significance, that we had to focus on certain things in a certain room would have a different level of significance. It might not be important to the narrative of the space, but it would be important to the heritage quality of the building. And to kind of compare how that would work, we can look at the same condition in 2 almost identical spaces, and that's the House of Commons foyer and the Senate foyer. Whereas the House of Commons foyer, the door to the chamber is just a simple wood door. In fact, it's always left open, but in our model it was closed. And there's nothing really unique about it. It's a beautiful door, but it has no actual heritage or cultural significance to the space. But in the case for the Senate, that door is incredibly important because it has the individual crests of all of the provinces and territories of Canada. And so it needed to be included at a higher level of detail. So in this case, for the House of Commons foyer, the door was at an LOD1, but in the Senate foyer, it was at an LOD 1.5 to make sure that that heritage quality and that significance was shown in the space. Same in the Library of Parliament. That Queen Victoria sculpture statue is the most important thing in the space. I mean, some might argue the books are more important, but it's actually the statue that she follows you around and kind of stares at you wherever you are. And she is the focal point of the space. So she had to be at the highest level of detail of anything else in there. So she was reserved as the LOD2 item, as long as a few other small little pieces. So the last idea was storytelling. And this is how we thought that by choosing certain things to be at a higher level of detail, it would draw your eye to them and help in aiding that whole narration going through it. And so these are images as we've been working on the spaces. So on the left, you can see the Senate chamber with everything at an LOD1. There's nothing that really is striking and draws your attention. Your eye just keeps dancing around and looking at all the different factors. It's still a nice space, but you're not really drawn to a key element. Whereas on the right, as the Senate chamber progressed in its development, we start to bring in elements that are at a higher level of detail, and your eye is starting to be drawn to them. So you're drawn to the war paintings on the wall that are in LOD 1.5. You see these stained glass windows in the background at LOD 1.52, and then you see the chairs, the speaker's chair. There's a shadow on it, so you don't see it that great, but it has it's at an LOD 2 as well as the sculptures around it. And your eyes are starting to be brought to this, but what you're not looking at is that the furniture and the desks, they're there, they help make the space. The wood paneling on the walls is nice, but you're not drawn to those spaces, or those items as much because they're not at as high of a level of detail. And the same for the Senate foyer. The stone architecture definitely helps create the space, but what your eye is drawn to are those paintings and that stained glass window. So this just is a quick video of one of our first attempts at how we could compare, like draw our attention to it. So here it's a much more higher contrast because the LOD2 item is the only thing colored, but you can see how kind of it really draws your attention to it and it makes you want to grab at it. Okay. I think we're doing good for time. So just quickly to talk about a few current issues that we're doing. Since this is the first time we're really implementing this level of detail system, we of course are coming up with lots of problems. But that's part of the challenge of research and part of the fun. And the first is that idea of accuracy versus instances. So when we talked about the level of detail from the building information model, we talked about accuracy and about how we wanted to record the actual space and it was accurate to the point cloud. But when you want to bring these things into Unity, that's really not going to work anymore. It's going to slow things down. That you want to have repeated objects brought in once and then loaded in once and then repeated in a space. So if you see these chairs, that's actually only one chair model that then is repeated within it. So it only has to draw that information once from the network. So that's great. We've generalized all of the different, say, columns in it. But the LOD2 items are still a record of what is actually accurate to real world. And when we start overlapping the LOD2 items and the LOD1 items, we're coming up with some conflicts, which you can see here. The wall and the carvings that are on it are now starting to collide funny. So we fixed that. We kind of manipulate it to make it work, but it's definitely something that's causing a little bit of struggle in the lab. And then the next is the idea of realism. I hate the word realism. It's definitely been a problem in this project. And that's because the first time, when we first wanted to do LOD1, the idea was no texture. And then when we first were, okay, we need some kind of texture, it was going to be generic textures that we could repeat over and over again. But that actually was more distracting because the wood grain wasn't right, it didn't go in the right direction, it was too large, things like that. So we now have to spend a lot of time painstakingly getting the direction of that wood grain right. And that's making it so then that LOD1 is becoming more realistic and more accurate to the real world, even though we're still using generic textures. But the other way, it was not blending into the background. And then just to kind of finalize, this isn't an issue, this is just an image. The project, as it keeps going, this idea of realism and quality and level of detail, it's definitely something that's been fun to experiment with. But we're still trying to figure out exactly how it can lead through the narration, because in the end, is the narrative the same as the cultural significance of the building? And that's kind of one of the things we're trying to figure out. So, thank you.